talk in wrapping up this first section is really giving you some background over what's going to be presented the rest of today and tomorrow. And so in this, looking at general considerations, I'm going to hit on a bunch of topics, and you're going to see them go into much more depth in several talks. But as you're thinking about, as other presenters are speaking, how what they're talking about is impacting your overall management. And so what I want to do is I'm going to break this down into things before synchronization, during, and then after. And how do we get our best management to get our best conception rates possible? And so some of these things you've heard a little bit about, but when we think about what should we think about when selecting heifers that are going to be successful in these programs? Well, one of the things to really begin to think about as you're starting to implement these things is what have your pregnancy rates been over the past several years? And that gives you a good feel for what the development strategy of your heifers are, how your management has been, and are you going to be successful? If you have high success with natural service breeding, you have a lot of heifers getting bred early, that's a good group of heifers or a good system to go into to be able to implement these technologies and start off very successful. Then, as Dave Patterson mentioned earlier on growth implants, it's important to remember some of these implants, if given at the wrong time, can have very detrimental effects on uterine glands, and therefore actually really impact negatively fertility within a herd. Then looking at target weights, and really these last two affect cyclicity, and looking at puberty in heifers. And when we look at puberty, puberty always comes up as one of the most critical factors impacting fertility in replacement heifers. And when we look at that, I put up there, have you selected the appropriate target weight? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in detail. Typically, when we do studies, we look at about 65% of mature weight. And then also track scoring. And these two I want to talk about a little bit further. And one of them is when we think about target weights. And there's a lot of debate that can be talked about target weights on developing heifers to 55 versus 65%. Well, a lot of the work that has been done at US Mark there in Nebraska has showed basically heifers reach puberty around 55% of mature weight. But how accurate are you at knowing what 55% of mature weight is? And so that really is walking on the knife's edge. And this right here is a study that'll show you a prime example. When heifers ended up developed a little bit less at 50%, you can see almost 16% fewer of them got bred in the first 30 days than those that were at 55%. And so when you start looking at that and you start deciding how I'm going to be developing my heifers, it's critical to realize where your animals are and making sure, and that 65% of mature weight was really developed for greater than 90% of animals to be cycling at the start of the breeding season. And it gives you that cushion to make sure the majority of them have reached puberty. When we think about reproductive track scores, and this goes along a lot with what Dr. Patterson showed earlier, and this study was done, and the reason I want to show this study to highlight it is actually when we look at the AI conception rates the first year, that's exactly what was shown earlier in a much larger data set. Those animals that are at a reproductive tract score 1 and 2 have much lower conception rates than those that are in the peripubertal stage at 3 or that have reached puberty at 4 and 5. And when you look at pregnancy rates, so those that got bred during the breeding season, we actually see the same thing. And we can see that even though they get bred, not all of them are doing as good as those that have reached puberty prior to the breeding season. And then as you would expect, those that conceive early, calve earlier, and have more pounds of calf weaned. Now what makes this study interesting is they actually followed them through the second year. And most people would think these animals that conceived should be fine their second year, correct? But when you look at what happened their second year, those animals that were a reproductive tract score 1 or 2 had lower conception rates but still conceived during the breeding season. What did they do to AI the second year? They had lower conception rates again. And those are the most expensive animals to lose from your herd. And so it really begs the question, those track score 1 and 2, should they even be maintained in your herd? And looking at what puberty status is before the start of the breeding season becomes critical on heifers. Well, what about cows? Well, we're really talking about a lot of the same things. And so what have your pregnancy rates been? If pregnancy rates are good in a short breeding season, then it becomes critical to continue that, and those become good animals to actually implement reproductive technologies on. And when you look at several of these, they come down to similar things. So if we look at body condition score at calving, body condition score at start of breeding season, that's really looking at how much energy they're maintaining to be able to go in to that breeding season. And this is a critical time point because this is the period in which the follicles are developing that we're going to be using during the breeding season. How many days postpartum? Gets back to cyclicity. It was mentioned earlier on some things, questions on anestrus animals. We know that uterine involution takes about 30 days. And we know conception rates are greatly decreased if we try to breed animals at 30 days or less. And so having sufficient postpartum interval becomes critical to the success when we implement these in cows. This goes back to what is the current length of your breeding season? And do we need to actually separate those cows into multiple groups that we're going to synchronize? Sandy was just talking about the newest version of the synchronization planner allows us to come in and do multiple groups. And sometimes that's the best management practice we can to get the best results and give some animals greater time. And then ultimately, what percentage are cycling before the start of the breeding season? And so several of those relate to that anestrus interval. And the simple fact is, animals that aren't cycling can't be bred. Now we have the progestin protocols that will help induce cyclicity, but it really depends on how deep anestrus they are. And typically in postpartum cows, we know that the anestrus interval ranges between 35 and 60 days. And so we want to give sufficient time period for those animals to undergo uterine involution and actually begin normal estrus cycles. And the longer, if we're in situations of drought or other situations that would prolong that anestrus period, it can have huge detrimental effects on RAI conception rates. Now, another area I want to briefly touch on is an area we've been researching for the past several years, is looking at the vaccination. And what impact does this have, and when should it be done pre-breeding? We really need to make sure our replacement heifers are set up correctly. We need to make sure that we work on their immunity early in life. And so around the time of weaning, we need to be getting those initial vaccinations into them. And our extension veterinarian there at SDSU that I work with quite a bit, really he teaches in his classes, and when he's given presentations on it, thinks of it as not every animal responds the exact same to every vaccination. So they need to go through the initial dose and their booster doses to get that level of immunity that's needed within the herd. We really need to be thinking about getting vaccinations in 45 days or more pre-breeding, and I'll explain this a little bit more in the next couple of slides. And then one of the biggest things and one of the biggest detriments we've seen is that if an animal has not previously been vaccinated, we need to avoid modified lives anywhere near the beginning of the breeding season. And so if you have naive animals, if they have not previously been vaccinated, there can be huge detriments to them. And one of the biggest things, as Dr. Smith pointed out on estrus cycles, it's important that an animal has a normal cycle to be able to conceive. And what we did a few years ago was we took a group of naive animals and we vaccinated them either with a modified live or an inactivated vaccine. And what you can see here is almost 40% of those animals that were given a modified live as they were a naive animal had an abnormal estrus cycle. And those abnormal estrus cycles, there's no way for those animals to conceive. Now, what really stood out to us is those abnormal cycles, and you may say, oh, well, some of the literature will actually tell you it's higher than 40%. Well, that's true. But what we wanted to look at in this study was what happens if we give it at the start of a synchronization protocol. Because at the start of the synchronization protocol, we really come in and we induce ovulation of dominant follicle. And so we actually vaccinated these animals, and then we started the protocol where they all got GnRH. And we know from the literature from 30 years ago that the viral side of these vaccines will impact this follicle and have detriment on luteal function. But if we got rid of that follicle, what was going to happen here? Well, we actually saw negative effects there, and that 40% abnormal cycles came from this ovulation 9 days later. And then what really surprised us was when we bred these animals, even on this second cycle, we only had 30% conception rates. And there is literature, there is data in the literature that actually supports that, saying in naive animals, the negative effects can be seen for up to multiple cycles, 30 days or longer. And so if you have a group of heifers, especially, that has never been vaccinated, we want to make sure and not use modified lives in these animals because of the negative impacts it can have. Now the question is asked, how often do we have naive animals around? That really depends on locations and what your vaccination programs is and where you get the heifers from. I can tell you several stories on animals that were bought and said, oh yes, they were vaccinated this way. Well, it ended up they weren't. So what we recommend is if you haven't given the injection, you can't guarantee it was given. Well, then one of the questions that would actually ask then, well, what about in well-vaccinated animals? So we've actually done a couple of studies now. We're up to about 18 herds and over 3,000 head that we've looked at, modified lives versus inactivated vaccines, given at the start, or given pre-breeding in mature cows. And this was a study we actually just did a year or so ago, where we actually gave modified live somewhere between 27 and 89 days pre-breeding versus an inactivated vaccine. And we can see AI conception rates were significantly lower. Now as you look, breeding season, there was no difference. So what does that tell us? That tells us there's something that is transient in the system that has to allow these animals to recover to actually have good fertility. And so we went back and broke the data set into intervals on when were they vaccinated. And it didn't matter if they were given a modified live or an inactivated vaccine. Those animals that were given it short, being less than 45 days, we had decreased conception rates than those animals that were between 46 and 89 days. In both groups actually had better conception rates. And so one of the things we have to realize is when we initiate the immune system in these animals, we actually do change a lot of things, and we want to give vaccines early enough to allow animals to recover from that before we go into the breeding season. So what about, we do everything right. We have our heifers developed, we have long enough postpartum interval on our cows, we're ready to breed cows. What do we need to start thinking about now at the start of the breeding season? Well, one of the things that's been touched on in an area we've done a lot of work in is estrus detection. And the importance of those animals going through, as Dr. Smith lined out, the physiological changes of the drop in progesterone, the rise in estradiol, ovulation, and then the rise in progesterone again, to get good conception rates, and the timing at which all of that occurs. So it's critical that we detect animals in estrus to have good conception rates. There's several estrus detection aids out there. It's the ones that you are familiar with and can utilize the best. They do a good job helping you know which animals have shown estrus, and why is that so important? This was a study done at CSU several years ago, looking at intensive versus casual. And so they didn't use the estrus detection rates. Intensive was actually an electronic system, so the animals were monitored 24 hours a day. Casual was they went out 30 minutes morning and evening, and Dr. Smith kind of addressed this with that 15% that had a short duration of estrus. But when you look at following the synchronization protocol, 86% of them were detected in estrus with intensive, but only 56% were detected with casual. So you're starting off with a 30% difference. What about conception rates? So what are conception rates? Conception rates are the percentage of animals that conceive out of those that semen was put into. So realize there's 14% here that did not get semen. There's 44% here that did not get semen. There's still a 20% difference in conception rates, even though every one of these animals was detected in estrus. Well, that's conception rates, but what about pregnancy rates? Pregnancy rates are the percentage of animals that conceive out of the total that were available to be bred. And so when you multiply these across, you can see a 71% pregnancy rate versus only a 35%. And I think anybody'd be happy with a 71, and everybody'd be extremely disappointed with a 35, and it's totally based on estrus detection. And so when we talk about those things, and Sandy kind of brought it up, the amount of time put into estrus detection becomes critical. And that's why we see some of the big differences. I know of herds that actually have better conception rates going to fixed time AI because of the amount of effort they were putting into estrus detection, versus other herds that do a tremendous job heat detecting and continue to do that every year. Why that difference in conception rates? And this will be addressed more on the male side too, but really AI is a compromise. Because we've got two things that have limited lifespan. The sperm has a limited lifespan, and the egg have a limited lifespan. And the goal, and what estrus detection really allows us to do, is it tells us the timing on when we need to put that semen in. And the reason it's so critical, and Dave brought it up on the split time AI, getting more cows in estrus. Because when we know that begins, now we know the timing of things, and we can see that if we inseminate animals too early, we start running into limits of the lifespan of the semen. And so what happens? We have low fertilization rates, but high embryo quality, because the oocyte is good and healthy, but the sperm is starting to die. When we inseminate too late, we get high fertilization rates because there's lots of semen there, but we have low embryo quality because the oocyte is, or the egg is starting to die. So where is our compromise? Really at about that 12 hours after the onset of estrus. Now there definitely are bowl differences, but knowing that onset of estrus is what's critical to helping us know the correct time to breed animals. So when do cows show estrus? This is a group of random cycling cows. There's actually 3 different studies up here, several hundred head. And what you can see is they spread out, but actually the majority of them show heat in the evening. Now one of the things being in South Dakota, far enough north, heat detecting in the summertime is great. We have daylight starting about 5:30 in the morning, and it doesn't get dark till about 10:30 at night. But we've got several fall breeding herds that are starting to breed in October, where we don't get daylight until 8:39 in the morning, and we start getting dark at about 4 in the afternoon. I mean, going to work in the wintertime, it's dark when you get there, it's dark when you leave. So this is where the estrus detection aids become critical. Believe me, I've tried to heat detect black cows in the dark. It's hard to do. And so having those benefits to know what animals show heat when you can't be there becomes critical. The other thing to realize when you add synchronization onto this is every one of the protocols, and Dr. Patterson put up some of the distributions, have a distribution of estrus following that prostaglandin injection. And based on the timing of that, we can skew this ratio to the majority of them showing heat during the day or the majority of them showing heat at night. And so it becomes critical that you understand the protocols you're using, and if you're going to do heat detection, that you use the aids or know when the peak times for you to be there to detect estrus are. Well, what about fixed time AI? And this has been talked about by everybody this morning. It is still extremely critical. And the reason why on that, this is a summary slide. One of my graduate students a couple of years ago, we went through, there's 26 different studies up there. There's over 10,000 head that uses every one of the recommended and some of the no longer recommended fixed time AI protocols in heifers and cows both. And what this actually shows you is this line is 0. And so any of the dots on this side of the line show that there was a benefit to animals in estrus prior to fixed time AI. Over those 10,000 head, over all of the different protocols, heifers and cows both, it averaged a 27% improvement in fertility among the animals that showed estrus. And so when we think about a 27% improvement, knowing that the animals had shown estrus gets to be huge. And what's interesting is a more recent group, they've been selecting animals for high fertility. And one of the things they've seen as they've selected fertility is increased estrus activity. And so we can use that physical exhibition of estrus as something we can easily detect for all the physiological changes that Dr. Smith was talking about this morning. So we know all of those changes are critical for setting up the timing of the uterus, for setting up sperm transport, and we actually have a good visual sign that allows us to set up that timing. Well, what about inseminator efficiency? When we think about inseminator efficiency, most people think immediately to AI. But we also have inseminator efficiency issues with natural service too. But one of the things we actually know is if an animal shows estrus, we get semen in the correct place at the correct time, fertilization rates occur about 95% of the time. So what is the correct location with AI? We're aiming for the uterine body. Because what we want to do is be able to allow that semen to flow equally into both horns. What happens if we don't get into the uterine body? Well, the data would tell us that there's about a 10% decrease if it ends up in the cervix. How often does that occur? A study that actually tracked some of it said up to 20% of the time. But at the same time, there hasn't been shown any benefits to depositing it further into a uterine horn. And one of the critical things about going too deep is if we end up scratching the endometrium and get blood into the uterus, we also get decreased conception rates. So proper semen placement becomes critical. So we get semen, we get animals set up correctly. We get them bred at the correct time. We get semen in the correct place. Now we're done with things, right? Everything else taken care of? No, actually it becomes even more critical. Made the comment that fertilization occurs about 95% of the time, but that's not what any of our conception rates or pregnancy rates are on. And so now we need to start thinking about our herd management and what's going on that can affect that embryonic or fetal mortality. And we know several things can impact it, including genetic factors, heat stress, asynchrony between the embryo and the uterus, sire effects. I'm going to focus mainly on nutrition and shipping stress, because these are two of the biggest things we can easily think about and manage that can have big impacts on conception rates. Dr. Smith started talking about this some, and I just want to continue. We've got to think about the timeline that embryo development occurs in. And so as we think about that, we see animals are in estrus on day 0. They ovulate about 30 hours later, so that's when fertilization takes place. We see migration to the uterus about day 5 to 6. Anybody doing stuff with embryo transfer, we have that blastocyst formation about day 7. What's interesting is Dr. Smith pointed out here, maternal recognition of pregnancy. 2 weeks after you breed that cow or that bull breeds the cow, before she even knows she's pregnant. And so one of the things I like to point out to people is, what's the easiest thing to lose? Something you didn't even know you had. And so that cow for these first 2 weeks doesn't even know if she's pregnant or not. And the reason that becomes critical is when we look down here, attachment to the uterus starts about day 20, but it's not definitively attached until day 42. So what does that mean? So in cattle, when we're thinking about things, that embryo is floating in the uterus for the first month of pregnancy, totally living off of the secretions into the uterus. So anything we do management-wise that can affect that uterine environment is going to affect that embryo survival. Well, one of the obvious ones is people like to move their heifers right after they breed them. They like to develop them in one place and then, well, I'm done with them. Well, what happens when we move those animals? This was some work done in Montana where they actually synchronized an AI to animals and then they moved them at different time points after AI. And literally what they did was they loaded them into a truck, drove an hour down the interstate, turned around, drove an hour back, and put them back in the same pen. So there was no change in diet, location, or anything else. What happened? If they moved them really quick after AI, days 1 to 4, that embryo was still up in the oviduct, had good synchronized pregnancy rates. What happened if they moved them right before maternal recognition of pregnancy? They saw about a 12% decrease. What about right around the time of attachment? 9%. Even out to day 45 to 60, and what's interesting here is these animals were preg checked before they went on the truck. They still saw about a 6% loss. And so there is enough stress. We can stress animals, and yes, heifers tend to be more susceptible to it than cows. The physical movement of these animals can stress them enough to actually cause some embryonic loss. What about management stress? This is an area we've been working on for several years, trying to look at what happens when we change the diet of an animal around the time of AI. And one of the reasons for that is it's fairly common for heifers to be developed one place or one way, and then at time of AI get moved somewhere else where it's easier for them to go to grazing. And so they're in South Dakota and the upper Great Plains. Typically they're in a feedlot through the winter and they're turned out to grass in the spring. Well, what happens when we go through any type of diet change at the time of AI? And so what we've done over the years is actually look at what effect it can have. And I just want to show a couple of the studies here. I don't have time to go into all of them. We had a group that was developed in a dry lot, a group that was developed out on range for at least 30 days. So they may have spent part of the winter in the dry lot, but they had at least 30 days or more pre-breeding grazing experience. They were all synchronized and AI'd the exact same way. They were all turned out into the same pastures together within each herd. So what did we see? What would you expect when you took a group of animals and turned them out to the same pasture? You would think their performance would be the same, wouldn't you? Every one of these, the group that had prior grazing experience had higher average daily gains. And this is average daily gain from AI to preg check at day 45. So a 45-day period, improved performance. What did that do to conception rates? There's a 10% difference in pregnancy rates within each location. And each location here, literally all we did was split their heifers in half. And like I said, they're out in the same pasture, grazing the same thing after AI. Is it anything to do with puberty? Like I said, we shoot for 65%. We're over 90% of them cycling before the start of the breeding season. So what happened? We wanted to see what their behavior was like. So we took a small group. This is 30 heifers out on a 30-acre pasture. And we put pedometers on them. What do heifers do when they get moved from a dry lot to pasture? Well, the group that had prior grazing experience, they went back out to pasture and they're walking somewhere around 8,000 steps a day. What happened to those heifers that had spent from weaning to the next spring in the dry lot? Their first day out on grass, they took 17,000 steps. The analogy I like to use on that is, let's sit around all winter and then the first nice day of spring, let's go run a marathon. What's that going to do to your body? The other interesting thing is it took 5 days for them to calm down enough, because literally they sat there and just lapped the pastures. It took 5 days for them to calm down, and the interesting thing about these pedometers is they not only told us the number of steps, but they tell us when the animal's standing up and when it's laying down. And there was no difference in the amount of time standing and laying between the two groups. It was about 12 hours each. So when they're taking this many more steps in the same amount of time, how much are they consuming? So if it took 5 days, can a 5-day nutrient restriction actually impact the embryo? So we worked with the University of Minnesota on this. We actually have 8 different replicants we did in here, where we took heifers, had been weaned, were being developed all at a constant rate. At time of AI, we restricted half of them to 80% of their energy requirements. Can a simple restriction to 80% of what they need impact the embryo? And then on day 6, we flushed the embryos. And what was interesting is what we saw, there's no difference in embryo recovery rate. So we didn't do anything to impact ovulation rate. But what we did impact was embryo stage and embryo quality. If you look, embryo stage was almost 1 stage lower for those that were restricted. So that means that embryo was developing at a slower rate, because all of these animals are fixed time AI to the same bowl. Embryo quality was almost 1 grade poorer. So for embryo quality, we want a lower number is a better quality grade. Now what's related to that, as stage was poorer, there were actually fewer cells, and of the cells that were there was more of them that were dead on a simple 6-day restriction of energy. So if it's really an energy restriction, we should be able to fix it. So one of the studies we did was we took heifers, had no grazing experience, synchronized AI, and then half of them we took them out to a pasture and supplemented. And since they couldn't go in the same pasture and be supplemented, we actually worked with one of our range scientists and did our forage clippings. And we made sure that the group that went to pasture alone went to the higher quality pasture. Then what we did was we actually supplemented with 5 pounds of dried distillers per head per day from AI to preg check. And I point out to people, there's nothing magical about distillers grains. The reason we used distillers was the Corn Council funded the study and gave us the distillers. We've had producers use it with all kinds of feedstuffs, whatever we can to get the energy into those animals, but we had figured out that 5 pounds would get enough energy into them that we should not undergo any nutrient restriction. Would that do to pregnancy success? We were able to regain that 10% that we showed we lost, those animals that got moved to grass. And so we really do need to look at how our heifers are, or our cows, and make sure they're not going through any nutrient restriction. And so a lot of these things, when we think about the breeding season and post-breeding, consistency becomes critical. So how do you determine what went wrong? I got 2 quick slides I want to show you here. A lot of this really goes back to the equation of reproduction. which has been around for several years, that has been worked on. And honestly, when I get phone calls on problems, this is where my mind starts thinking of how to go through things. What % of animals were detected in estrus and inseminated? What was the inseminator efficiency? What was the fertility level of the herd? What was the fertility level of the semen? And you'll see these 4 topics come back to throughout the remainder of the conference. But if we take all of these and we put them as a percentage, and of course if we do everything perfect, we get 100% conception rates. But being on a college campus and working with students, I get informed, it only takes a 70 to pass a class or pass a test. What happens when we just pass each one of these? We get a 24% conception rate. And so one of the big things with reproduction is nothing can compensate for something done bad. Any one of those factors, if it's done bad, we can't make up for by being perfect in the other ones. And the best analogy for that, we can do everything perfect, and if we put dead semen into them, you know what your conception rates are going to be? 0. So potential problems. Cattle are not good candidates. I see this frequently. We had a group of heifers this year. A producer was trying to get them bred early. They were about 12 months old. They hadn't reached puberty. Very low conception rates. He knew it going into it, but he was trying to push his heifers. So you have to understand, are they good candidates? Protocol compliance. This has been talked about quite a bit. Dr. Patterson showed moving the timing of fixed time AI as little as 8 hours can have huge impacts on conception rates. Facilities. Sandy mentioned getting the cows brought through in a consistent amount of time, getting them bred in the window for fixed time AI. How do we stress the animals? Are we moving them? Are we maintaining their condition after breeding season, or after breeding during the breeding season? And probably the one I tell students the most about is everything with reproduction is the details. It's the little details that have the big impact on reproductive performance. And in all the years I've been doing things, very seldom have I seen an impact that it's biological activity of the products. Usually it's something more on the management side of things. And so with that, I will turn it back over, and I don't know if we have time for questions, or we'll do questions later. So.
Time for